Every mother knows the heartbreak of watching her child go hungry. Every widow understands the fear of losing the only home your family has ever known. In Dry Hollow, Clara was facing both. With her husband gone and the bank demanding payment, she had 3 days before they'd lose everything. Her 6-year-old daughter Ellie didn't understand why Mama cried at night or why they ate beans for every meal. All Ellie knew was that her mother needed help, and sometimes help came from the most unexpected places. When the giant cowboy rode into town that dusty afternoon, something told Ellie he was different from the others. His eyes held kindness beneath the weathered brim of his hat. So she did what any desperate child would do. She ran into the street and asked for help. What happened next would change their lives forever. But could a marriage of convenience ever become something real? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Clara Murphy bent over her sewing machine, her fingers working with practiced precision despite the tremor of exhaustion. The old singer, a wedding gift from her late husband Thomas, wheezed and stuttered with each stitch, much like everything else in her life these days, thread thin and fraying at the edges. Through the single window of their modest home, she could see Ellie crouched in the dirt patch they generously called a garden, talking earnestly to a collection of smooth stones she'd arranged in careful rows. Each stone had a name, a personality, a story that only a 6-year-old could conjure from imagination and desperate loneliness. Clara's heart clenched, watching her daughter create friends from nothing because real playmates cost money for treats and toys they couldn't afford. "Mama, Mr. Henderson says his Stone family is hungry too," Ellie announced, padding inside on bare feet. Her cotton dress, once yellow as summer sunshine, had faded to the color of old cream, let out twice at the hem and patched at both knees. "Does he now?" Clara managed a smile, though her fingers never paused in their work. Mrs. Kowalski's Sunday dress needed finishing by noon, and noon meant $2 enough for flour, beans, and perhaps a precious egg. Ellie climbed onto the wooden crate beside Clara's chair, her small hands folding themselves with unconscious mimicry of her mother's posture. "Maybe we could share our beans with them?" The innocence of the question pierced Clara's composure like a needle through silk. She stopped sewing, gathering her daughter close, breathing in the sweet scent of sun-warmed hair and childhood's last remnants of carefree joy. "Sweet pea, the stones don't actually eat." "I know, Mama." Ellie's voice carried a gravity that shouldn't belong to someone so small. "But sometimes pretending helps when your stomach feels empty." Clara closed her eyes, fighting the familiar burn of tears. When had her child become so wise about hunger? When had she failed so completely at the one job that mattered most? The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention to the window. Dry Hollow saw its share of travelers, cowboys driving cattle, merchants hauling goods, drifters seeking work or trouble, but this rider commanded attention even before he came into full view. His horse, a magnificent sorrel mare with intelligent eyes, moved with the controlled power of an animal that trusted its rider completely, but it was the man himself who made Clara's breath catch. He stood easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorframe and hands gentle on the reins, despite their obvious strength. Dark hair showed beneath his worn hat, and his jaw carried the kind of stubble that spoke of long days in the saddle rather than careless grooming. Even from a distance, there was something about his bearing, straight-backed, alert, dangerous in the way of a wolf at rest, that marked him as different from the usual drifters. "He's big as a mountain," Ellie whispered, pressing her nose to the glass. Clara found herself nodding. The stranger's presence seemed to fill the street, though he made no obvious display of authority. Other men stepped aside without appearing to notice they'd done so. Women paused in their daily rounds to steal glances from behind curtains and partially open doors. Even the mongrel dogs that usually barked at anything on 4 legs or 2 simply watched him pass. "Clara Murphy," "You mind your own business," she murmured to herself, but her eyes followed the rider until he disappeared behind Jameson's general store. The interruption cost her precious minutes, and she returned to her sewing with renewed urgency. The singer's mechanical voice filled the small room, a familiar rhythm that usually soothed her nerves. Today it sounded like a clock ticking toward disaster. Thomas would have known what to do. Thomas had possessed the rare gift of finding opportunity in crisis, of seeing solutions where she saw only problems. When the cattle fever swept through the area 5 years ago, claiming both livestock and the men who tended them, Thomas had already begun talking about other ways to make their mark. "Clara, my love," he'd said in that voice that always made her believe in impossible things. "Your fingers can create magic with thread and needle. We'll build something together, you and I." The fever took him 3 weeks later. Now the same creative hands that Thomas had praised worked desperately to keep their daughter fed and their small home from falling into Jeremiah Cross's grasping fingers. Cross owned half of Dry Hollow already: the saloon, the hotel, most of the good grazing land, and the bank that held her mortgage. Each month brought new families displaced by his ruthless acquisition of defaulted properties, and each month Clara watched their belongings loaded onto wagons as they headed toward uncertain futures in distant towns. The bank notice lay folded in her sewing basket, its harsh words memorized through repetition. Final notice of default. Payment in full required within 72 hours or property will be subject to immediate foreclosure proceedings. Tomorrow marked day 3. Ellie had wandered back outside, her stone friends calling her to adventures Clara couldn't provide. Through the window, she watched her daughter's animated conversation with imaginary companions and wondered how long childhood's protective magic could shield her from the reality of their situation. Soon, there would be no garden for games, no familiar walls to shelter them, no community of neighbors who'd known Ellie since birth. The singer's needle broke with a sharp ping, jerking Clara from her dark thoughts. She stared at the ruined thread, the half-finished seam, the impossibly small amount of progress made toward an impossibly large goal. $2 wouldn't save them any more than 200 would. The sum needed to clear their debt might as well have been 2,000 for all the chance she had of raising it. A knock at the door startled her from despair. Mrs. Henderson from across the street stood on the narrow porch, her weathered face creased with the particular sympathy reserved for widows and orphans. "Clara, dear, I hope you don't mind the intrusion." "Not at all, Mrs. Henderson. Please, come in." Clara rose, automatically smoothing her skirts and checking that her hair remained pinned in its neat bun, despite the morning's struggles. "I won't keep you from your work. I know you're busy." "Mrs." Henderson's eyes took in the broken needle, the scattered fabric, the signs of controlled panic that Clara tried so hard to hide. "I wanted you to know that if you need somewhere for Ellie to stay for a few days, just temporarily, you understand Harold and I would be happy to help." The offer hung in the air like morning mist, well-intentioned but somehow making everything seem more fragile. Clara understood what wasn't being said. When the bank came tomorrow, when the sheriff followed with eviction papers, when another family became another cautionary tale about the price of misfortune in Jeremiah Cross's domain. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Henderson, but we'll manage." The older woman nodded, though her expression suggested she'd expected that response. "Of course you will, dear. You're Thomas Murphy's wife. You've got his strength in you, even if you can't see it right now." After Mrs. Henderson left, Clara stood in her doorway watching Ellie play among her stone friends. The afternoon sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber: the dusty street, the weathered buildings, her daughter's hair as she bent over her imaginary world. Beautiful and heartbreaking, and slipping away like sand through her fingers. The sound of hoofbeats returned, and the tall stranger rode past again, heading toward the far end of town, where the newer houses gave way to open prairie. This time, his gaze swept across her small home, lingering for just a moment on the sight of a woman in a doorway and a child at play in the dirt. Clara couldn't read his expression beneath the shadow of his hat brim, but something in that brief attention made her pulse quicken with emotions she couldn't name. "Who's that man, Mama?" Ellie had abandoned her stones to watch the rider's progress. "I don't know, sweet pea. Just a traveler, I suppose." "He doesn't look like just anything," Ellie said with the uncanny perception of childhood. "He looks like someone with important things to do." Clara pulled her daughter close, inhaling the scent of sunshine and innocence while she still could. "What kind of important things?" Ellie considered this gravely. "Maybe helping people who need it." From the mouths of babes, Clara thought, though she'd long since stopped believing in the kind of help that arrived on horseback, like something from one of Thomas's old adventure stories. Real life required practical solutions, work, money, luck, and the kind of miracles that came from human effort rather than divine intervention. But as evening shadows lengthened across Dry Hollow, and as she tucked Ellie into the narrow bed they shared, Clara found herself thinking about the stranger's steady gaze and her daughter's innocent faith in the possibility of help from unexpected places. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or perhaps it was the desperate hope that flickered in every mother's heart when all other lights seemed to be going out. Either way, she would discover tomorrow just how much faith a 6-year-old girl could carry, and how far a mother's love could stretch when everything she held dear hung in the balance. The next afternoon brought with it the kind of heat that made even the lizards seek shade. Clara sat at her sewing machine, racing against time and the relentless mathematics of poverty. Mrs. Kowalski's dress was finished, bringing their total funds to $4.37, enough for a week's worth of beans and flour, but nowhere near the $86 needed to satisfy the bank. Ellie had been unusually quiet all morning, her stone friends apparently engaged in serious conversations that required whispered consultations and careful rearrangement. Clara watched her daughter through the window, noting the way she kept glancing toward the street as if expecting something. "Mama," Ellie said, appearing suddenly at her elbow with the silent grace that sometimes startled Clara into remembering how much her daughter resembled Thomas in unexpected moments. "I need to go outside for a minute." "Stay where I can see you, sweet pea. It's too hot to wander far." But Ellie was already moving, her small bare feet carrying her toward the front door with unusual purpose. Clara started to call after her, then caught sight of the approaching rider through the window. The tall stranger from yesterday rode slowly down Main Street, his posture relaxed but alert, like a man comfortable with being watched. What happened next would replay in Clara's memory for years to come, each detail etched with the sharp clarity that crisis brings to ordinary moments. Ellie walked directly into the middle of the dusty street, her faded dress bright against the brown earth, her arms wrapped around the rag doll that had been her constant companion since Thomas's death. The doll, sewn from scraps of her father's old shirt, bore the gentle wear of countless conversations and adventures, its button eyes slightly loose, its yarn hair faded from yellow to cream. The giant cowboy saw her immediately and drew his horse to a gentle stop, the animal's hooves raising small puffs of dust that danced in the afternoon light. For a moment, man and child simply regarded each other, he seated high above on his magnificent sorrel mare, she standing fearless and small in the street below. "Please help my mom," Ellie said, her voice carrying clearly in the stillness. The words were simple, direct, spoken with the absolute conviction that only children possess when they believe deeply in something. Clara's heart stopped. Through the window, she watched her 6-year-old daughter address a complete stranger with a request that laid bare their desperation for anyone to hear. Shame and terror warred in her chest as she stumbled toward the door, but she was too late to prevent what came next. The cowboy studied Ellie for a long moment, his face shadowed beneath his hat brim. When he spoke, his voice carried the deep resonance of a man accustomed to being obeyed, but his tone held surprising gentleness. "Only if she marry me today." The words fell into the afternoon heat like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of shock through the gathering crowd of onlookers. Clara froze in her doorway, certain she'd misheard, certain the world had tilted off its axis and she was falling through space toward some impossible reality. Ellie tilted her head, considering this response with the seriousness she brought to all important negotiations. "Are you a good man?" "I try to be." "Will you be nice to Mama?" "Yes." "Will you help us keep our house?" The cowboy's gaze shifted from Ellie to Clara, and even across the distance between them, she felt the weight of his attention like a physical touch. "Yes." Ellie nodded once, apparently satisfied with these terms. "Then I think that would be okay. But you should ask her yourself. She's right there." Every eye on Main Street turned toward Clara, who stood frozen in her doorway, like a deer caught in lantern light. The rational part of her mind catalogued the impossibility of the situation, a complete stranger proposing marriage to solve her problems, her daughter conducting negotiations like a tiny diplomat, the entire town witnessing what would surely become the most talked-about scandal in Dry Hollow's history. But beneath the shock and embarrassment, a desperate voice whispered calculations. Marriage meant protection from foreclosure. Marriage meant legitimacy. Marriage meant Ellie would have food and shelter and a father figure, even if that figure was a man whose name she didn't even know. The cowboy dismounted with fluid grace, his boots hitting the ground with soft thuds. Up close, he was even more imposing, easily 6.5 feet tall, with the kind of presence that suggested controlled strength rather than mere size. His clothes were travel-worn but well-maintained, his gun worn with the casual familiarity of a man who knew how to use it. But his eyes, now visible beneath his hat brim, held something unexpected, kindness and a bone-deep weariness that spoke of burdens carried long and alone. "Ma'am," he said, touching his hat brim in a gesture so polite it seemed to belong to another century. "Name's Boone. Boone Thatcher. I believe your daughter and I have been discussing a business arrangement." Clara found her voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Mr. Thatcher, I think there's been some misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding." His voice was calm, matter-of-fact, as if proposing to strangers was an ordinary part of his Tuesday routine. "You need help. I can provide it. The terms are simple. You don't even know me." The words came out sharper than she'd intended, defensive and wounded. "You don't know anything about me or my situation. I know you're a widow trying to raise a daughter alone. I know you're behind on your mortgage and the bank's breathing down your neck. I know Jeremiah Cross has his eye on this property and a dozen others like it." Boone's gaze was steady, neither judgmental nor pitying. "I know you work from dawn to dusk trying to make ends meet, and I know that little girl loves you enough to ask a stranger for help because she can see you're drowning." Each word hit like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. Clara felt her carefully constructed facade of managing, of coping, of somehow making everything work crumble under the weight of such clear-eyed assessment. "And what do you know about marriage?" she asked, her voice tight with emotions she couldn't name. "What makes you think you can just ride into town and—" "I know it's a contract," Boone interrupted gently. "I know it can provide protection and stability for people who need both. I know it doesn't have to be about love to be useful." The crowd had grown larger, drawn by the unprecedented drama unfolding in broad daylight on Main Street. Clara could feel their stares, hear their whispered conversations, sense the mixture of shock and fascination that would fuel gossip for months to come. In a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, she was about to become the most discussed woman in 3 counties. Ellie tugged at Boone's coat, drawing his attention down to her upturned face. "Mama's scared," she announced with 6-year-old directness. "She's been scared for a long time, but she tries not to let me see it." "Smart girl," Boone said, his voice so gentle it made Clara's chest ache. "Fear's nothing to be ashamed of. Sometimes it helps us make good decisions. Like saying yes when someone wants to help." Exactly like that. Clara felt the world closing in around her, the weight of impossible choices, the pressure of public scrutiny, The terrible arithmetic of survival that left no room for pride or proper courtship or any of the normal progression of human relationships. Tomorrow the bank would come. Tomorrow would bring eviction papers and the end of everything she'd tried to build from the ashes of her husband's death. "I need time to think," she managed. Boone nodded, as if he'd expected this response. "Time's one thing you don't have much of, ma'am. But I'll be at the hotel if you change your mind. The offer stands until tomorrow morning." He touched his hat brim again, remounted his horse with the same fluid grace, and rode away, leaving Clara standing in her doorway with her daughter's hand in hers and the eyes of the entire town weighing her response to the most impossible proposal in Dry Hollow's history. That evening, as Clara tucked Ellie into bed, her daughter's voice pierced the darkness with uncomfortable wisdom. "Mama, sometimes when you're drowning, you have to grab whatever rope someone throws you, even if you don't know who's holding the other end." Clara stared at the ceiling long into the night, listening to her daughter's peaceful breathing and wondering if salvation always came wrapped in packages too strange to accept. Clara spent the darkest hours before dawn sitting at her kitchen table, staring at the silver pocket watch that had belonged to Thomas. Its steady tick marked the passage of time she didn't have, counting down toward a decision that felt impossible from every angle she examined it. The watch had been Thomas's most prized possession, not for its modest value, but for what it represented. "Time is the only thing we can't buy more of," he'd always said, "so we'd better spend it wisely." Now she wondered what wisdom looked like when every choice led toward some form of loss. Through her window, she could see the first pale suggestion of sunrise touching the eastern horizon. Soon, the town would wake, and with it would come either salvation or ruin. The arithmetic was brutally simple: accept Boone Thatcher's impossible proposal, or watch everything slip away like sand through her fingers. Ellie stirred in their shared bed, murmuring something about stone friends and tall cowboys in her sleep. Even in dreams, her daughter seemed to understand what Clara struggled to accept. Sometimes help came from the most unexpected places, and pride was a luxury they could no longer afford. A soft knock at the door interrupted her brooding. Clara opened it to find Mrs. Henderson, her face drawn with the particular exhaustion that comes from sleepless nights spent worrying about neighbors. "Clara, dear, I saw your lamp burning all night. I thought you might need some coffee and company." They sat together in comfortable silence, two women who understood loss and the weight of impossible decisions. Finally, Mrs. Henderson spoke the words that had been circling in Clara's mind like buzzards. "Harold and I saw what happened yesterday. The whole town's talking, of course, but most folks understand desperate times call for desperate measures. Do they?" Clara's voice was hoarse from the night's internal arguments. "Because it feels like madness to me. Harold married me for my father's land," Mrs. Henderson said quietly. 43 years ago, when drought killed our crops and debt was swallowing homesteads whole. I barely knew him, but I knew he was decent and hard-working, and I knew my family needed saving." Clara looked up, surprised by this revelation about the couple she'd always assumed had married for love. "It took time," Mrs. Henderson continued, "but respect grew into affection, and affection grew into something deeper. Not the wild passion you read about in novels, but something steadier. Something that lasted through lean years and good ones, through raising children and burying parents, and all the ordinary trials that test a marriage." "But you knew him," Clara protested. "He was part of your community, your life. This man, Boone Thatcher, he's a complete stranger. Sometimes strangers see our situations more clearly than folks who've watched us struggle for months." Mrs. Henderson's weathered hands wrapped around her coffee cup. "Maybe that makes them better positioned to help." An hour later, Clara watched through her window as the Kowalski family loaded their belongings onto a wagon, another casualty of Jeremiah Cross's expanding empire. 3 children under the age of 10, a mother clutching a baby, a father whose shoulders bent under the weight of failure there, but for the grace of God and Boone Thatcher's impossible offer. She found him at the hotel's small dining room, sitting alone at a corner table with a view of the street. Up close, in the soft morning light, she could see details that had escaped her notice yesterday. The small scar along his jawline, the careful way he held his coffee cup, the silver pocket watch chain visible beneath his vest. Like Thomas, he was a man who valued punctuality, Mr. Thatcher. He rose immediately, hat in hand, and waited until she was seated before resuming his place. Manners, Clara noted. Whatever else he might be, he was a gentleman. I accept your proposal, she said without preamble. No point in dancing around the central issue when time was bleeding away like water from a cracked bucket. But I have conditions. I'd expect nothing less from a woman with sense. This is a business arrangement, nothing more. You'll have your own sleeping quarters, and you'll respect the boundaries appropriate to our circumstances. Agreed. Ellie comes first in all decisions. Her welfare, her happiness, her future, everything else is secondary. Wouldn't have it any other way. Clara studied his face, looking for signs of deception or hidden motives, but found only calm acceptance. Why are you doing this? And don't tell me it's simple business. Men don't marry strangers for business reasons unless there's something more at stake. For the first time, Boone's composure flickered slightly. Let's just say I have my reasons for wanting to see Jeremiah Cross lose a round or two. Before Clara could pursue this intriguing statement, the hotel door opened and Cross himself entered, his presence filling the small dining room like smoke from a poorly vented fire. He was a man who cultivated intimidation, tall, broad-shouldered, with steel-grey hair and eyes like chips of flint. His expensive clothes marked him as prosperous, while his manner marked him as dangerous. Well, Cross said, his voice carrying the particular satisfaction of a man who enjoyed other people's discomfort. Mrs. Murphy and our mysterious visitor, how convenient to find you together. Mr. Cross, Clara managed, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. I trust you've given thought to your situation, Clara. The bank will be calling this afternoon, and I'd hate to see you and little Ellie forced out onto the street. Of course, I might be persuaded to buy your property for a fair price, say $20, which would at least give you traveling money. $20 for a home and land worth 10 times that amount. Clara felt her temper flare, but before she could respond, Boone's voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. Actually, Mr. Cross, I don't believe Mrs. Murphy will be needing your generous offer. Cross's attention shifted to Boone, and Clara watched something flicker in the older man's eyes. Recognition? Unease? It passed too quickly to identify, but the change in his demeanor was unmistakable. And you would be. Boone Thatcher, Clara's fiancé. The word hung in the air between them, transforming everything. Clara felt the shift immediately. She was no longer a vulnerable widow facing foreclosure alone, but a woman under the protection of a man whose presence had already begun to alter the balance of power in Dry Hollow. Cross's smile never wavered, but his eyes hardened. How fortunate for Mrs. Murphy to find such timely romance. I trust the bank will be satisfied with this new arrangement. I imagine they will be, Boone said mildly. Cash has a way of settling most disputes. After Cross left, Clara turned to her new fiancé, with questions crowding her throat like birds seeking flight. You have the money to pay off the mortgage? I do. $86, and then some. Then why? She stopped, realizing she was about to question the motives of the man who had just saved her home and her daughter's future. Never mind. I suppose it doesn't matter. But as they walked together toward Judge Morrison's office to arrange the hastiest wedding in Dry Hollow's history, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that it mattered very much indeed, and that she was about to bind herself to a man whose secrets might prove as dangerous as his protection was valuable. Judge Morrison's parlor had witnessed many weddings over the years, but none quite like the ceremony that took place that Tuesday afternoon. Clara stood beside a man she'd known for less than 24 hours, wearing her best dress. a deep blue cotton that Thomas had always said brought out her eyes, while 6-year-old Ellie served as their only witness. The judge, a kindly man in his 70s who'd known Clara since childhood, spoke the traditional words with gentle authority, though his eyes reflected the same bewilderment that seemed to afflict everyone who heard about this union. When he asked if there were any objections to the marriage, Ellie raised her hand. "I have something to say," she announced solemnly. "Ellie," Clara began, mortified. "Mr. Boone," Ellie continued, fixing her new stepfather with a serious stare, "you have to promise to take good care of Mama's heart. It's been sad for a long time." Boone knelt to bring himself to Ellie's eye level, his large hands gentle on her small shoulders. "I promise to do my best, little miss. That's all any man can do." "That's good enough for me," Ellie declared, apparently satisfied with this arrangement. The ceremony concluded with a handshake rather than a kiss, a practical sealing of their business agreement that left Clara feeling strangely hollow. She was married again, but to a stranger who slept in her barn and called her Mrs. Thatcher, with the same polite distance he might use with any acquaintance. The first week of their arrangement passed in careful navigation of domestic boundaries. Boone proved himself useful in ways Clara hadn't expected, fixing the loose shutter that had banged in every wind, reinforcing the chicken coop that had been slowly collapsing, splitting enough firewood to last through winter. He worked with quiet efficiency, never presuming to make decisions about her household, but somehow anticipating needs before she voiced them. More surprising was his immediate rapport with Ellie. The child who had been shy around most adults took to her new stepfather with the enthusiastic adoption of a lonely puppy finding its pack. She followed him around the small property, chattering about her stone friends and asking endless questions about his horse, his travels, his opinions on everything from the weather to the proper way to braid a rope. Clara found herself watching these interactions with a mixture of gratitude and unease. Ellie's laughter had returned bright peals of joy that had been absent since Thomas's death, but Clara worried about her daughter's growing attachment to a man who remained essentially a stranger. "Where did you come from before here?" Ellie asked one morning as Boone brushed down his mare in the small stable behind their house. "Lots of places," he answered, his hands steady on the curry brush. "I've been traveling for a long time. Don't you have a family somewhere?" Boone's movements paused almost imperceptibly before resuming their rhythm. "Not anymore. Like us, before you came, something like that." Clara, listening from the kitchen window while she prepared their breakfast, heard the careful way he deflected personal questions, revealing nothing while seeming to answer everything. Whatever had brought Boone Thatcher to Dry Hollow, he wasn't ready to share those reasons with anyone, not even the child who'd already claimed a piece of his carefully guarded heart. The arrangement might have continued indefinitely in this state of polite coexistence, if not for Jeremiah Cross's escalating pressure. It began subtly. Suppliers suddenly reluctant to extend credit, long-time customers finding reasons to take their sewing elsewhere, small but persistent intrusions on their daily life that carried the unmistakable message of displeasure. Clara noticed the changes immediately but chose to say nothing, hoping the harassment would fade, once Cross accepted that she was no longer vulnerable to his predatory acquisition schemes. She should have known better. The confrontation came on a Saturday evening as Clara returned from delivering Mrs. Patterson's mended quilt. 3 of Cross's men waited in her front yard, their horses tied to her fence posts, their presence an unmistakable violation of the unspoken boundaries that governed civilized behavior. "Evening, Mrs. Thatcher," said Jake Morrison, Cross's foreman and the judge's wayward nephew. "Nice night for a ride." Clara clutched her sewing basket closer to her chest, acutely aware that Boone was still in town and Ellie was inside alone. "Good evening, Jake. Is there something you need? Mr. Cross wants to make sure you're settling into married life real comfortable-like, wants to know if your new husband is treating you right." The implied threat hung in the air like smoke from a poorly banked fire. Clara felt her pulse quicken, but kept her voice steady. "How thoughtful of Mr. Cross to take such interest in my personal affairs." He's a caring man, our Mr. Cross, hates to see folks make decisions they might regret later. Before Clara could respond, Boone's voice cut through the gathering dusk with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Evening, gentlemen. Something I can help you with?" He appeared around the corner of the house with the silent grace that seemed characteristic of his movements, but Clara noticed immediately that his hand rested casually near his gun, not threatening, but ready. Jake Morrison's confident smirk flickered slightly as he took in Boone's imposing presence. "Just making social calls, Thatcher. Welcoming you to the community." "Much obliged," Boone said mildly. "Those social calls usually don't require 3 armed men in a family's front yard after dark. Careful times call for careful precautions." "They do indeed." Boone's voice carried no heat, but something in his tone made the horses shift restlessly. "Which is why I'd appreciate it if you'd move along and let my family enjoy their evening in peace." The word family landed with particular emphasis, claiming Clara and Ellie as his responsibility in a way that transformed the dynamic entirely. This was no longer 3 men intimidating a lone widow. This was 3 men testing the resolve of a husband and father who'd already proven himself willing to take extreme measures to protect what was his. Jake Morrison might have been inclined to press the issue, but his companions were already moving toward their horses, recognizing something in Boone's stillness that spoke of controlled danger. "Another time, then," Morrison said, his attempt at casual dismissal undermined by the haste with which he mounted his horse. After they'd ridden away, Clara found herself standing in her yard beside a man she'd married for protection, realizing for the first time how thoroughly that protection had already begun to reshape her world. Boone Thatcher wasn't just a convenient solution to her financial problems. He was a force of nature that had quietly inserted itself between her family and the threats that circled them like wolves around a campfire. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded once, his attention still focused on the direction the riders had taken. "They'll be back. Cross doesn't give up easily when he wants something." "What do you think he wants?" Boone's gaze shifted to her, and in the fading light she caught a glimpse of something that might have been regret. "More than just your land, I suspect." That night, as Clara lay awake listening to Ellie's peaceful breathing, she wondered what she'd gotten herself into by accepting help from a man whose past remained as mysterious as his motivations, and whether protection always came with complications she hadn't anticipated. 2 weeks into their marriage of convenience, Clara discovered Boone reading to Ellie from a worn copy of Robinson Crusoe, his deep voice bringing the adventures to life with the skill of someone comfortable with literature. She paused in the kitchen doorway, listening to his narration of Crusoe's resourcefulness in building shelter and finding sustenance on his island. "Did he get lonely?" Ellie asked, curled against Boone's side on the small sofa that had been Thomas's favorite reading spot. "I imagine he did," Boone replied thoughtfully. "Being alone for so long would be hard on any man. People need other people, even when they think they don't. Like you needed us." Boone's pause was barely perceptible, but Clara caught it, the slight hesitation of a man carefully considering his words. "Maybe so, little miss. Maybe so." The scene struck Clara with unexpected force. Not just because of the domestic intimacy it represented, but because of the easy intelligence Boone displayed in his choice of books and his thoughtful responses to Ellie's questions. This wasn't the simple cowboy she'd imagined when he first rode into town, but an educated man with depth she was only beginning to discover. That evening, after Ellie had fallen asleep, Clara found herself drawn to the wooden crate where she kept Thomas's letters, dozens of pieces of correspondence from their brief courtship and early marriage, filled with dreams and declarations of love that had sustained her through the dark months after his death. She pulled out her favorite, written during their engagement when Thomas had traveled to Denver for supplies. "My dearest Clara," it began in his careful script, "not a moment passes that I don't think of you and the life we'll build together. You have brought purpose to my days and hope to my future in ways I never imagined possible. When I return, I want to hear every detail of your week, what you've sown, what you've read, what small joys have brightened your hours in my absence. Your happiness has become the measure of my own success in this world." The letter continued for 2 pages, full of the romantic devotion that had marked their relationship from the beginning. Thomas had courted her with poetry and wildflowers, declaring his love within a month of their first meeting and proposing marriage with all the passionate certainty of a man who knew his heart completely. Now she was married to a man who called her Mom and had never spoken a word of affection, whose motivations remained as mysterious as his past, who protected her family with quiet efficiency but revealed nothing of his inner thoughts or feelings. The contrast should have made her melancholy, but instead it stirred something more complex, a growing curiosity about the man who disrupted her, carefully ordered desperation with his unexpected proposal. What had shaped him into someone who could read Dickens to a 6-year-old but slept alone in a barn? What had brought him to Dry Hollow at precisely the moment when her family needed salvation? Her contemplation was interrupted by voices from the yard, Boone's steady bass and another man's higher tones engaged in quiet conversation. Clara moved to the window and saw him speaking with Doc Patterson, the town's physician, and one of the few men in Dry Hollow who commanded universal respect. "Not saying you're wrong," Doc was saying as Clara caught the thread of their conversation. "But Cross has deep roots here, deeper than most folks realize. I'm not planning to uproot anything," Boone replied, "just planting some boundaries." Boundaries have a way of becoming battle lines when men like Cross are involved. You sure you want to risk that kind of fight with a new family to protect? Clara watched Boone's profile in the moonlight, noting the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Sometimes a man doesn't get to choose his fights, Doc. Sometimes they choose him. After Doc Patterson left, Clara remained at the window, watching her husband, for that's what he was, legally, if not emotionally, tend to his horse with the same careful attention he brought to every task. There was something almost meditative about his movements, as if the routine of brushing and feeding the animal provided a form of peace he found nowhere else. The next morning brought troubling news that seemed to confirm Doc Patterson's warnings. Mrs. Kowalski, who'd taken her family to live with relatives in Colorado Springs after losing their farm, had sent word that Cross's influence extended far beyond Dry Hollow. The land baron had connections throughout the territory, business partnerships that gave him leverage over banks, suppliers, and transportation companies across 3 counties. "He's been building an empire," Mrs. Henderson explained over coffee, her voice low with concern. "Buying up distressed properties, forcing out families who've lived here for generations, consolidating power in ways that make folks nervous to speak against him." Clara absorbed this information with growing unease. If Cross's reach was as extensive as Mrs. Kowalski suggested, then her marriage to Boone might have protected her home, but put her family in the crosshairs of a much larger conflict. That afternoon, as she worked on alterations for the banker's wife's ironic work, given the circumstances, Clara found herself studying Boone through the window as he repaired fence posts with methodical precision. His movements spoke of military training, she realized, noting the way he approached each task with tactical consideration rather than simple manual labor. When Ellie skipped out to help, chattering about her day and asking endless questions about fence construction, Clara watched Boone's careful responses with new attention. He answered her daughter's questions with patience and good humor, but always in ways that revealed nothing about his own experiences or background. "Have you ever built fences before?" Ellie asked, handing him nails with the serious concentration of a 6-year-old assistant. "A few times," Boone replied, accepting each nail with grave appreciation for her help. "Were they big fences or little fences?" "Different sizes for different purposes." "What purposes?" "Keeping things safe, mostly." It was masterful deflection, Clara realized, watching him guide the conversation away from personal details while never making Ellie feel dismissed or unimportant. But it was also frustrating evidence of how thoroughly he guarded his privacy, even from the family he'd sworn to protect. That evening, as they shared their simple dinner of beans and cornbread, elevated by fresh vegetables from the garden, Boone had somehow coaxed into productivity. Despite the poor soil, Clara found herself studying his hands. They were working hands, calloused and scarred, but they held his fork with the precision of someone comfortable with more formal dining situations. "Mr. Thatcher," she began, then caught herself. "Boone, may I ask you something?" He looked up, his expression alert but cautious. "Of course. Before you came here, what did you do for work, I mean?" The question hung in the air between them, while Ellie continued eating, apparently absorbed in arranging her beans into geometric patterns on her plate. Boone's pause stretched long enough to become uncomfortable before he answered. "I was a soldier." Two words that explained everything and nothing, delivered with the finality of a man closing a door. But they were the first personal details he'd volunteered since their wedding, and Clara felt their significance like sunlight through clouds. For how long? Long enough. And that, apparently, was all she would learn for now about the man who'd become her husband, her protector, and increasingly, the subject of her most persistent thoughts. 3 weeks after their courthouse wedding, Clara found herself drawn to the small trunk Boone kept in the barn, the only personal possessions he'd brought beyond his horse, saddle, and weapons. She hadn't intended to pry, but while looking for extra lamp oil, she noticed the corner of a leather-bound book protruding from beneath his neatly folded clothes. It was a Bible, she discovered, worn soft from countless readings, its margins filled with careful notations in Boone's precise handwriting. The pages fell open naturally to Psalms, and Clara found herself reading the underlined passages that had clearly provided comfort during difficult times. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." Find what you were looking for? Clara jumped, her heart hammering, as she turned to find Boone standing in the barn doorway, his expression unreadable. Heat flooded her cheeks as she realized how her investigation must appear. "I was looking for lamp oil, and I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. It's all right." He stepped into the barn, closing the distance between them with his characteristic quiet grace. A wife should know something about her husband's faith. "You're a religious man." It wasn't quite a question, but Boone nodded anyway. Trying to be, some days are easier than others. Clara looked down at the open Bible in her hands, noting the careful annotations that spoke of serious study rather than casual reading. Thomas used to say that faith wasn't about having easy days, but about finding grace in the difficult ones. Your Thomas sounds like he was a wise man. The gentle way he spoke her late husband's name without jealousy or dismissal, but with genuine respect, struck Clara as profoundly decent. Most men might resent the shadow of a beloved first husband, but Boone seemed to understand that Thomas's memory was part of what made her who she was. "He was," she said softly. "He believed that God put people in our paths when we needed them most." Maybe he was right. That evening, after Ellie had fallen asleep, Clara found herself lingering on the front porch while Boone checked the property's perimeter, a nightly ritual she'd come to appreciate for the security it provided. When he returned, instead of heading directly to the barn as usual, he paused at the porch steps. "Mrs. Thatcher, Clara, there are things about my past that might complicate our arrangement if they came to light." Clara's pulse quickened. "What kind of things?" "The kind that make enemies." Boone's voice carried the weight of old regrets. "I served in the war, and afterward I did work that some might consider questionable. Made choices that seemed right at the time, but left consequences I'm still living with." "Are you in danger? Are we in danger because of you?" "I don't know," he admitted, and the honesty of that uncertainty was somehow more reassuring than false promises of safety would have been. "But I need you to know that if trouble comes looking for me, I'll do everything in my power to keep it away from you and Ellie." Clara studied his profile in the moonlight, noting the tension in his shoulders that spoke of burdens carried alone for too long. Why did you really come to Dry Hollow, Boone? Same reason most men come to frontier towns, looking for a fresh start. And Cross? Your reaction to him suggests this isn't just about protecting us from foreclosure. Boone was quiet for so long that Clara thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a heaviness that made her chest ache with sympathy she hadn't expected to feel. Jeremiah Cross destroyed my family when I was young, took our land through legal manipulation that was technically lawful but morally bankrupt. My mother died in poverty because of his greed, and my father drank himself to death trying to forget what he'd lost. The admission hung between them like a bridge. Clara wasn't sure she was ready to cross. So, helping us was also about getting back at him. It started that way, Boone admitted, but it's become something else entirely. Before Clara could ask what he meant, the sound of approaching riders broke the intimate moment. 3 men emerged from the darkness, their faces grim in the lamplight spilling from the house. Clara recognized Sheriff Williams immediately, but the other 2 were strangers, well-dressed men with the bearing of federal officials. "Evening, Boone," the sheriff said, his voice carefully neutral. "These gentlemen are looking for you." The taller of the 2 strangers stepped forward, his badge catching the light. "Boone Thatcher, you're wanted for questioning in connection with the robbery of a federal payroll convoy outside Denver 6 months ago." Clara felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Federal robbery. Her husband, her protector, the man who read Bible verses and children's stories with equal devotion, was wanted by federal marshals for stealing government money. "I was nowhere near Denver 6 months ago," Boone said calmly, but Clara noticed his hand had moved closer to his gun. "You'll find witnesses who can account for my whereabouts." "Maybe so," the marshal replied, "but you're going to have to come with us while we sort this out. Peacefully, I hope." Clara watched her husband, for she realized with surprise that she'd begun thinking of him that way. Despite their arrangement, weigh his options with the same methodical consideration he brought to every decision. She could see him calculating distances, assessing threats, determining whether resistance was worth the risk to her and Ellie's safety. "Boone," her voice surprised her with its steadiness. "Whatever you've done or haven't done, running won't help anyone." He looked at her then, and she saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, gratitude mixed with what might have been affection, or perhaps something deeper. "You're right," he said quietly. Then to the marshals, "I'll come peacefully, but I want your word that my family won't be harassed while I'm gone." "You have it," Sheriff Williams said, though the federal men remained silent. As they prepared to leave, Boone approached Clara with careful movements that acknowledged the weapons trained on him. "There's money hidden in the barn enough to keep you and Ellie comfortable for months. Whatever happens, don't let Cross pressure you into anything while I'm gone." "How long?" she whispered. "I don't know. But Clara," he paused, seeming to struggle with words that wouldn't come. "This changes things between us. You have every right to..." "To what?" "Abandon my husband when he needs support." The words came out more forcefully than she'd intended, surprising them both. "I may not know everything about your past, Boone Thatcher, but I know the man who's been caring for my daughter and fixing my fence posts and reading Bible verses by lamplight. That man wouldn't rob anyone." As they led him away, Clara stood on her porch, watching until the riders disappeared into darkness, wondering when she'd stopped thinking of their marriage as a business arrangement and started believing in the possibility of something real between them. Behind her, Ellie's sleepy voice drifted from the doorway. "Mama, where's Boone going?" Clara turned to gather her daughter close, breathing in the sweet scent of childhood and innocence, while her heart wrestled with questions she wasn't ready to answer. "He's helping some people sort out a misunderstanding, Sweet Pea. He'll be back. You promise?" Clara looked out at the empty road, thinking about faith and trust, and the courage required to believe in someone whose past remained largely a mystery. "I promise we'll wait for him." It was a promise that would test every assumption she'd made about love, loyalty, and the price of second chances. Boone returned 3 days later, cleared of all charges when alibis proved his innocence, but the brief separation had shifted something fundamental between them. Clara found herself watching for his approach with an anticipation that had nothing to do with practical concerns and everything to do with emotions she wasn't ready to examine too closely. What she wasn't prepared for was the locked strongbox he carried into their home that evening, setting it on the kitchen table with the careful reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a man about to change everything. "Something I should have told you from the beginning." Clara sat across from him, Ellie playing quietly with her rag doll in the corner, while Boone opened the box to reveal a collection of documents that would rewrite her understanding of everything that had happened since his arrival in Dry Hollow. "My name isn't Boone Thatcher," he began, his eyes never leaving her face. "It's Boone Cross. Jeremiah Cross is my father." The words hit Clara like cold water, stealing her breath and leaving her staring at the man she'd married as if seeing him for the first time. Cross, the name that had haunted her nightmares, that represented everything cruel and grasping about their situation, belonged to the man who'd saved them from it. "That's impossible," she whispered. "I wish it were." Boone's hands were steady as he spread documents across the table, property deeds, legal papers, and correspondence that painted a picture of systematic fraud and manipulation spanning decades. "He abandoned me and my mother when I was 8 years old, left us with nothing while he built his empire on other people's misery." Clara's mind raced, trying to reconcile this revelation with everything she thought she knew. The federal marshals were acting on information he provided. False information, designed to get me away from you and Ellie long enough for him to pressure you into selling. Boone's jaw tightened. It's his pattern. Create crisis, offer solutions, profit from desperation. "So our marriage," Clara's voice caught on the words, "was it all revenge? A way to hurt him?" The silence that followed felt endless. Clara watched emotions play across Boone's face, regret, pain, something that might have been love if she dared to hope for such a thing. "It started that way," he admitted, and Clara felt her heart crack like ice in spring thaw. "When I saw what he was doing to you, to other families, I saw an opportunity to strike back at him while helping someone who needed it." "I see." Clara's voice sounded distant to her own ears. "So, I was useful. Ellie and I were weapons in your war with your father." "No." The word came out sharp, desperate. "Clara, that's not it. Became something else entirely. You became something else entirely." But Clara was already standing, her chair scraping against the wooden floor with harsh finality. The careful trust she'd been building, the growing affection she'd begun to feel, the possibility of love she'd started to entertain, all of it crumbled under the weight of deception. "Get out." "Clara, please, let me explain." "Get out of my house." Her voice carried a coldness that surprised them both. "Take your documents and your revenge and your lies, and get out." Ellie looked up from her doll, confusion clear on her small face. "Mama, why are you angry at Boone?" "Because sometimes people aren't who they pretend to be, sweet pea." Boone gathered his papers with movements that seemed suddenly heavy, weighted down by regrets too large to carry. At the door he paused, his hand on the frame, without turning around. "Everything I told you about my feelings, about caring for you and Ellie, that was real. Whatever else you believe about me, believe that." After he left, Clara sank into her chair and stared at the space where the strongbox had been, feeling as though the foundations of her carefully rebuilt life had shifted beneath her feet. She'd been a fool to trust, a fool to hope, a fool to believe that salvation could come without strings attached. "Where did Boone go?" Ellie asked, climbing into Clara's lap with the instinctive need for comfort that children possess. "Away, sweet pea. He won't be staying with us anymore. But he promised to take care of us." People break promises sometimes. But even as she spoke the words, Clara's conscience nagged at her with uncomfortable truths. Boone had taken care of them, He'd protected them from Cross's harassment, provided security and stability, been genuinely kind to Ellie and respectful to her. Did his motivations matter more than his actions? The question tormented her through a sleepless night, and by morning she had her answer in the form of Jeremiah Cross himself, standing on her front porch with a satisfied smile that made her skin crawl. "Good morning, Clara. I trust you've had time to reconsider my offer for this property. I'm not selling, Mr. Cross. I think you'll find circumstances have changed rather dramatically. Your husband, if we can call him that, given the deceptive nature of your union, has shown his true colors. A federal fugitive, wanted for robbery, hardly the sort of man a respectable widow should associate with." Clara kept her expression carefully neutral, despite the fury building in her chest. Boone was cleared of all charges. This time, but men like my son tend to accumulate enemies and legal troubles. Are you prepared to risk your daughter's welfare on such an unreliable protector? The casual way he referred to Boone as my son sent chills down Clara's spine. There was no warmth in the acknowledgement, no paternal concern, only the cold satisfaction of a man who'd successfully manipulated the situation to his advantage. $25, Cross continued. My final offer for a clean sale. Refuse, and I'll make sure every bank, every business, every potential employer in 3 counties knows about your association with a wanted man. He's your son, Clara said quietly. He's a disappointment who chose his path long ago. I'm offering you a chance to choose yours more wisely. After Cross left, Clara sat at her kitchen table with Thomas's letters spread before her, searching for guidance in words written by a man who'd believed in the fundamental goodness of people. What would Thomas do if faced with such impossible choices? How would he weigh deception against devotion, lies against loyalty? The answer came in Ellie's voice, wise beyond her years. Mama, even if Boone had bad reasons for helping us at first, he still helped us. And he was nice to me. Doesn't that count for something? Clara looked at her daughter, this child who'd been brave enough to ask a stranger for help, who'd seen something worthy in Boone before any adult had bothered to look beyond surface impressions and realized that perhaps wisdom came more easily to those who hadn't yet learned to doubt their own capacity for forgiveness. That afternoon, Clara walked to the hotel where Boone had taken a room, her heart hammering with each step. She found him sitting on the small balcony, staring out at the landscape with the 1,000-yard gaze of a man wrestling with regrets. "We need to talk," she said. He looked up, hope and wariness warring in his expression. "Clara, your father came to see me this morning, made his position very clear regarding our marriage and my future in this town." Boone's hands clenched into fists. What did he want? To buy my property for $25 and run me out of Dry Hollow. Clara sat in the chair across from him, noting the careful way he held himself, as if prepared for another rejection. He also made it clear that having his son as a husband would bring nothing but trouble. He's probably right about that. Maybe. But he's wrong about something else. Clara took a breath, gathering courage she didn't know she possessed. He thinks I married you for protection and money, that I'll run the moment things get complicated. Didn't you? Clara considered the question seriously, examining her own motivations with the same honesty she demanded from others. I did. But somewhere along the way, it became about more than that. It became about you reading to Ellie and fixing our fence, and the way you say grace over dinner like you really mean it. Boone's careful composure cracked slightly. Clara, I'm not finished. She leaned forward, her voice gaining strength. You lied to me about who you are and why you came here. That hurt. But you didn't lie about who you became while you were here. The man who protected my daughter and respected my boundaries and helped me feel less alone in the world, that man was real. And that's enough? Clara smiled, feeling lighter than she had in days. It's a beginning. Real marriages are built on a lot less, and I think we've got something worth building on. When they returned home together that evening, Ellie greeted Boone's return with the uncomplicated joy of a child whose world had been set right again. As Clara watched them together, she realized that sometimes the best things in life came wrapped in the most complicated packages, and that love, real love, might be less about perfect beginnings than about choosing each other again and again, despite the imperfections. The reconciliation between Clara and Boone lasted exactly 4 days before Jeremiah Cross escalated his campaign of intimidation to levels that transformed their domestic drama into something far more dangerous. It began with small acts of sabotage, their chicken coop mysteriously damaged overnight, their vegetable garden trampled by horses in the pre-dawn hours, supplies ordered from neighboring towns mysteriously failing to arrive. Clara had weathered such harassment before, but now it carried the particular venom of a man whose family reunion had been denied. "He's testing us," Boone explained as they surveyed the latest damage, their small barn's door hanging from its hinges, though nothing inside had been stolen. "Seeing how far he can push before we break." "And how far is that?" Clara asked, watching Ellie play among the wreckage with the resilient adaptability of childhood. "Further than he imagines." But Clara could see the strain in Boone's shoulders, the way his hand drifted toward his gun when shadows moved unexpectedly. He'd taken to sleeping in the house rather than the barn, claiming it was more practical for security purposes, though Clara suspected it had more to do with his growing protective instincts toward his makeshift family. The campaign of intimidation might have continued indefinitely in this pattern of escalating harassment, if not for the discovery Clara made while mending one of Ellie's dresses. Hidden in her sewing basket, beneath layers of thread and fabric scraps, she found something that made her blood run cold. A small pair of silver scissors, meticulously sharpened to razor-like precision that she'd never seen before. "Boone!" she called, her voice tight with controlled fear. He appeared immediately, alerted by her tone, and his expression darkened when she showed him the scissors. "When did you last use your sewing basket?" "This morning. These weren't here then." Clara's hands trembled slightly as she held the unfamiliar tool. "Someone was in our house while we were here." The violation of their private space, the casual invasion of the sanctuary they'd tried to build, struck Clara as more threatening than any of Cross's previous tactics. This wasn't harassment. This was a message about how completely vulnerable they remained, despite Boone's protection. "Pack what you and Ellie need for a few days," Boone said, his voice carrying the particular calm that Clara had learned meant controlled fury. "We're going to stay with Doc Patterson until this gets resolved. I'm not running from my own home." "You're not running. You're being strategic." Boone's gaze never left the scissors, as if studying them might reveal their true purpose. "Cross is escalating because his previous tactics aren't working. That makes him more dangerous, not less." Before Clara could argue further, Ellie's voice called from the front yard, "Mama, there's a lady here to see you." Clara recognized the woman immediately, Margaret Cross, Jeremiah's elegant wife, whose rare appearances in Dry Hollow were usually associated with charitable functions or social obligations. Today she looked uncharacteristically flustered, her usually perfect composure cracked by whatever had brought her to Clara's modest home. "Mrs. Thatcher," Margaret said, her voice carrying the cultured tones of Eastern education, "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I felt I had to speak with you privately." Clara invited her inside, noting the way Margaret's gaze swept the small rooms with something that might have been nostalgia. "Is there something I can help you with, Mrs. Cross?" "Actually, I'm hoping I can help you." Margaret's hands twisted in her lap, betraying nerves that didn't match her composed exterior. "I know about Boone. I know who he is, and I know what my husband is planning." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a dangerous fire. Clara felt her pulse quicken as she realized that this elegant woman might hold answers to questions she'd been afraid to ask. "What is he planning?" "To force Boone into a confrontation that will end with one of them dead." Margaret's voice cracked slightly. Jeremiah has never forgiven himself for abandoning his son, but he's too proud to admit his mistakes. Instead, he's convinced himself that Boone is a threat that needs to be eliminated. Clara's blood chilled. Eliminated? He's hired men, professionals. They're supposed to make it look like Boone drew first, died in a fair fight defending his family. Margaret's composure finally crumbled entirely. Clara, I've stood by for 30 years, watching my husband destroy people, telling myself it was just business. But I won't watch him murder his own son. The revelation struck Clara like a physical blow. Not just harassment, not just intimidation, but premeditated murder disguised as self-defense. And Ellie would be there to witness it, traumatized by violence that would steal away the father figure she'd only just begun to trust. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I loved that little boy once," Margaret whispered. "Before Jeremiah's pride poisoned everything, before business became more important than family. Boone was sweet and curious, and full of questions about everything. He deserved better than what we gave him." Clara felt pieces clicking into place, the careful way Boone deflected questions about his childhood, the bone-deep weariness she sometimes glimpsed in unguarded moments, the military precision with which he approached every task, as if preparation for battle was second nature. When? Tomorrow night, during the town dance, when everyone's distracted and witnesses can be managed. Margaret stood, her elegant composure returning like armor donned for battle. "There's more. Your property isn't the only thing Jeremiah wants. He's been systematically acquiring land around a proposed railway route. Your home sits on a crucial piece of that puzzle." After Margaret left, Clara found herself staring at the silver scissors again, understanding now that they weren't just a threat, but a calling card proof that Cross's hired killers could enter her home at will, that no lock or precaution could protect her family from men determined to complete their deadly mission. She found Boone in the barn, methodically checking his weapons with the same careful attention he brought to all potentially life-saving tasks. The sight of him there, tall, capable, utterly focused on protecting a family that had become more important to him than his own survival, made Clara's chest ache with emotions she was still learning to identify. "We need to leave," she said without preamble. "Tonight. Take Ellie and go somewhere. Cross can't find us." Boone looked up from his rifle, his expression gentle but resolute. "Running won't solve this, Clara. Men like my father don't give up when they want something. They just wait for you to get comfortable again before they strike. Then what do you suggest? We can't fight hired killers. We can be smarter than they are." Boone set down his weapon and moved toward her, his presence somehow both comforting and dangerous. "I spent years learning how to outthink enemies with better resources. This isn't so different." Clara wanted to argue, wanted to insist that they could build a life somewhere else, away from Cross's influence and the weight of old grudges. But looking at Boone's face, she saw something she was beginning to recognize as love, not the desperate passion Thomas had felt for her, but something deeper and more tested, forged in shared trials and mutual respect. "What about Ellie?" she whispered. "She'll be safe, I promise you that." "You can't promise that. You can't control everything that might happen." "No," Boone agreed, reaching out to touch her cheek with fingers that trembled slightly despite his calm demeanor. "But I can promise that I'll die before I let anyone hurt either of you." The words should have frightened her, but instead they settled something deep in Clara's chest, the last remnant of doubt about where Boone's loyalties truly lay. This wasn't about revenge anymore, wasn't about settling old scores with a father who'd abandoned him. This was about protecting the family he'd chosen, even at the cost of his own life. That night, as Clara lay in bed listening to Ellie's peaceful breathing and Boone's careful movements as he maintained watch, she made a decision that would have shocked the desperate widow who'd accepted a stranger's marriage proposal just weeks ago. Tomorrow, when Cross's hired killers came for her husband, they would find more than just a former soldier protecting his family. They would find a woman who'd learned that love wasn't always gentle, that sometimes it required steel and courage and the willingness to fight for what mattered most. Clara reached for Thomas's old sewing scissors, not the threatening ones left by intruders, but the familiar tools that had helped her create beautiful things from raw materials. Tomorrow, she would discover whether the same hands that could craft hope from desperation could also defend the life she'd built from the ashes of loss. Tomorrow would test every assumption she'd made about her own capacity for courage and about the price she was willing to pay to protect the unlikely family that had become her whole world. In the darkness, she whispered a prayer for strength, for wisdom, and for the kind of miracle that sometimes came disguised as ordinary people, finding extraordinary courage when everything they loved hung in the balance. The town dance proceeded exactly as planned, with half of Dry Hollow gathered in the community hall, while fiddle music masked the sound of approaching horses. Clara stood at her kitchen window, watching shadows move with purpose around the perimeter of their property, counting at least 4 men, positioning themselves with military precision. Boone had sent Ellie to spend the night with Mrs. Henderson, a precaution that had required careful explanation to avoid frightening the child. Sometimes grown-ups need to have serious conversations without little ears listening, Clara had said, hating the deception but knowing it was necessary. Now, as the final phase of Cross's plan unfolded, Clara felt the weight of Thomas's old military medal in her pocket, a tarnished piece of silver she'd never seen Boone wear but had found among his belongings. Whatever honors it represented, whatever service it commemorated, tonight it would serve as a reminder that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds. "They're in position," Boone said quietly, his voice carrying the calm certainty of a man who'd faced similar situations before. 4 professionals, maybe 5. They'll try to force me outside, where they can control the engagement. And if you don't go, they'll come inside. His smile held no humor. Either way, this ends tonight. Clara checked the modified sewing supplies she'd prepared, her sharpest scissors tucked into her boot, heavy spools of thread that could serve as projectiles, needles arranged for easy access. Makeshift weapons for a seamstress turned fighter, but she'd learned from Boone that preparation and surprise could overcome superior firepower. "The lamp by the front window, when I blow it out, that's your signal to move to the position we discussed," Boone instructed, checking his rifle one final time. "Stay low, stay quiet, and remember, don't hesitate if someone threatens our family," Clara finished. They'd rehearsed this conversation multiple times, but hearing the words aloud still sent ice through her veins. A voice called from the darkness outside. "Boone Cross, come out and face what you've got coming." "That's Morrison," Boone identified. "Cross's foreman. Probably means Cross is here too, watching from a distance." Clara moved to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. She could see Jake Morrison standing boldly in their front yard, flanked by 2 men she didn't recognize, hardened professionals whose casual confidence spoke of experience with violence. "Your choice, boy," Morrison called again. "Come out peaceful, and maybe your woman and the kid don't get hurt in the crossfire." The threat to Ellie made Clara's vision blur with rage. These men would use a child as leverage, would threaten an innocent to force Boone into an impossible position. The last vestiges of her civilized reluctance to violence evaporated like morning mist. Boone noticed her reaction immediately. "Clara, stay focused. Anger makes mistakes." She nodded, drawing on the same steady determination that had helped her survive Thomas's death and months of poverty. Tonight wasn't about anger, it was about love, and the lengths a mother would go to protect her family. "I'm coming out," Boone called back. "Give me a minute to get ready." But instead of moving toward the door, he positioned himself at the side window with a clear view of the barn, where additional men were undoubtedly waiting. Clara took her place near the back door, ready to circle around behind their attackers when the moment came. The waiting stretched into eternity, seconds that felt like hours, while Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She thought of Ellie, safe at Mrs. Henderson's house, and of Thomas, who'd always believed that good people could triumph over evil if they were willing to fight for what mattered. Then Boone blew out the lamp, plunging their home into darkness. The attack came immediately, not the careful stalking Clara had expected, but a violent assault designed to overwhelm through superior numbers and firepower. The front door exploded inward under the impact of heavy boots, while men burst through the side window Boone had been watching. But Boone wasn't there anymore. He'd moved to the kitchen, using their home's layout to create confusion among attackers who'd expected to find him positioned defensively. His first shot dropped one of the window invaders before the man could fully enter the house. Clara slipped out the back door as planned, her soft-soled shoes silent on the packed earth. The night air carried the sound of splintering wood, shouted commands, and the distinctive crack of rifle fire. Her peaceful home had become a battlefield, but she felt strangely calm as she moved toward the barn, where she'd spotted movement earlier. She found two men crouched behind her chicken coop, rifles trained on the house's rear windows. They were watching for Boone to attempt escape, never expecting a seamstress to emerge from the darkness behind them, with Thomas's scissors glinting in the moonlight. Clara struck without hesitation, her blade finding the gap between the nearest man's shoulder and neck before he could react. He collapsed with a strangled cry that alerted his companion, but Clara was already moving, using the skills Boone had taught her about close-quarters combat when conventional weapons weren't available. The second man turned his rifle toward her, but Clara was inside his guard, her scissors finding their mark with deadly precision. As he fell, she realized with crystalline clarity that she'd just killed two men to protect her family and felt no remorse whatsoever. The battle for their home and their future had only just begun. Clara had just retrieved one of the fallen men's rifles when Jeremiah Cross emerged from the shadows beyond their property line, his elegant presence incongruous among the violence and chaos. He moved with the confidence of a man who believed the outcome was already determined, flanked by two more hired guns who'd apparently been held in reserve. "Enough!" Cross called out, his voice carrying the authority he'd wielded for decades in Dry Hollow. "Boone, your woman just killed two of my men. Come out now, or I'll have her shot where she stands." The gunfire from inside the house had stopped, replaced by an ominous silence that made Clara's heart race with fear for Boone's safety. But before she could worry further, his voice responded from the darkness near the barn. "Let her go, old man. This is between you and me." "No, son. This became about her the moment you decided to play house with a widow and her brat." Cross's voice carried the particular venom of a man whose careful plans had been disrupted. "You always were too sentimental for your own good." Clara could see Boone now, moving carefully along the barn's shadow, his rifle ready but not yet aimed. Even in the dim moonlight, she could read the tension in his posture, a man calculating odds that weren't in his favor. 28 years, Cross continued, his tone becoming almost conversational. 28 years I waited for you to come crawling back, looking for forgiveness or money or whatever pathetic comfort you thought you deserved. Instead, you came back to play the hero. "I came back because you were destroying innocent families," Boone replied, still moving with careful precision. "Same as you destroyed ours. I built an empire. I created prosperity in this God-forsaken territory." Cross's composure cracked slightly, revealing the fury beneath his civilized veneer. "Your mother was weak, and you inherited her weakness, always caring more about other people than about what needed to be done." Clara felt her grip tighten on the unfamiliar rifle, rage building at the casual dismissal of a woman who died in poverty because of this man's greed. But she forced herself to remain still, trusting in the plan she and Boone had developed during their brief preparation time. "She was worth a dozen men like you," Boone said, and Clara heard something final in his voice, the sound of a man who'd stopped looking for his father's approval and started fighting for his chosen family instead. "Then you can join her." Cross's signal brought immediate action from his remaining men, but they'd made the fatal mistake of underestimating their opposition. Clara had positioned herself with a clear field of fire, and when the shooting started, she discovered that desperation and maternal fury could make even an inexperienced fighter deadly accurate. Her first shot took down the gunman closest to Boone, while her second forced the remaining hired killer to seek cover behind their water trough. But it was Boone's tactical brilliance that turned the tide. He'd spent their preparation time not just positioning weapons, but creating opportunities for psychological warfare. "Look around you, old man," Boone called out, his voice carrying over the echoing gunshots. "Your hired killers are dead or running. Your grand plan failed because you never understood what you were really fighting." Cross's remaining gunman made a desperate attempt to flank Boone's position, but Clara was ready. The simple thimble she'd worn while sewing countless garments became her salvation as she deflected the man's knife thrust, giving her the split second needed to bring her rifle to bear. Thomas's scissors, still blood-stained from her earlier encounters, found their mark one final time. Suddenly, the chaos stopped. Cross stood alone in their yard, his empire of intimidation reduced to one aging man with a gun, facing the son he'd abandoned and the family that son had chosen to protect. "It didn't have to be this way," Cross said, his voice carrying a weariness that Clara hadn't expected. "If you'd just stayed away. If you'd just left innocent people alone," Boone interrupted, stepping into the moonlight with his rifle trained steadily on his father's chest. "But you couldn't do that. You had to keep taking, keep destroying, keep proving that you were the biggest predator in the territory." For a moment, father and son faced each other across 30 years of pain and abandonment, while Clara watched from the shadows and wondered if this confrontation would end in patricide or some impossible reconciliation. "I gave you life," Cross said quietly. "And then you spent 28 years trying to take it back." Boone's voice held no anger now, only sad certainty. "It ends here, tonight. You're going to leave Dry Hollow and never come back. You're going to transfer ownership of all the properties you've stolen back to their rightful families. And you're going to pray that I never see your face again. And if I refuse..." Clara watched Cross's hand drift toward his gun, saw the calculation in his eyes as he weighed his chances of outdrawing his son. She also saw the moment he realized he was outmatched, not just by Boone's superior skill, but by the righteous fury of a man defending his family. The shot, when it came, surprised everyone. Cross staggered, looking down at the spreading red stain on his shirt, with the bewildered expression of a man who'd never expected consequences to find him. But the bullet hadn't come from Boone's rifle. Sheriff Williams emerged from behind the house, his smoking pistol trained on Cross, his face grim with the satisfaction of long-delayed justice. "Jeremiah Cross," he said formally, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, extortion, and about a dozen other crimes I'll be happy to list while you're bleeding." "You can't," Cross began, then collapsed as his legs gave out beneath him. "Actually, I can," Sheriff Williams replied. Seems like Mrs. Cross had quite a bit to say about her husband's business practices when federal marshals came calling this afternoon. Amazing how evidence accumulates when people finally decide to tell the truth. Clara emerged from the shadows, still clutching her rifle, hardly able to believe that the nightmare was finally over. Boone moved toward her with the careful movements of a man whose world had just shifted from mortal combat to miraculous survival. "It's finished," he said quietly, gathering her into his arms, while sirens from approaching medical help echoed in the distance. "Is it?" Clara asked, thinking of all the complications that would follow legal proceedings, community gossip, the challenge of building a normal life from the ashes of such extraordinary circumstances. "The fighting is..." Boone confirmed, his voice carrying the particular exhaustion that comes after surviving something that should have been impossible. "Everything else we'll figure out together." As Clara looked around, their property scarred by violence but still standing, still theirs. Still the foundation for whatever future they chose to build. she realized that sometimes the best victories were the ones that left room for healing rather than demanding perfect resolution. Cross would live to face trial, which was more mercy than he'd shown his victims over the decades. The hired killers were dead or captured, their threat permanently ended. And in the midst of all the destruction, a family had discovered that love could indeed grow from the most unlikely beginnings, taking root in soil enriched by shared struggle and mutual protection. The real test would come tomorrow, and all the days after, when they would have to prove that a marriage born from desperation could mature into something worthy of the blood spilled to defend it. 6 months later, Clara stood in the doorway of her expanded sewing shop, watching Ellie teach the neighbor children how to properly care for the garden that now flourished, where once only weeds had grown. The child's laughter carried on the warm afternoon breeze, bright and careless in the way that childhood should be when the world feels safe and full of possibilities. The shop itself bore little resemblance to the desperate enterprise Clara had operated from her kitchen table. With Jeremiah Cross's seized assets redistributed to his victims and his legal fees consuming the remainder, Clara had been able to purchase proper equipment, hire 2 assistants, and transform her survival skill into genuine prosperity. The irony wasn't lost on her that Cross's downfall had provided exactly the kind of economic opportunity he'd spent decades denying to others. "Mrs. Thatcher, the alterations for the Peterson wedding are finished," announced Mary Collins, one of Clara's new employees and the daughter of a family Cross had displaced 3 years earlier. The return of the Collins family, along with several others, had restored much of Dry Hollow's original character, while adding the particular resilience that comes from surviving hardship together. "Thank you, Mary. And please, call me Clara. We've had this conversation before." Mary smiled, still adjusting to the informal atmosphere Clara preferred in her shop. After months of working for an employer who treated her with respect rather than suspicion, the young woman had begun to show the natural leadership skills that poverty and displacement had previously hidden. The bell above the shop door chimed, and Clara looked up to see Margaret Cross entering with the careful grace of a woman still learning to navigate the world without her husband's intimidating presence. The former society matron had surprised everyone by remaining in Dry Hollow after Jeremiah's conviction, using her knowledge of his business practices to help authorities unravel decades of fraud while quietly working to repair some of the damage her silence had enabled. "Clara, I hope I'm not interrupting," Margaret said, her voice carrying the perpetual uncertainty that had replaced her former hauteur. "Not at all. How are you adjusting to the cottage?" Margaret's smile was genuine, but tinged with the particular sadness of someone learning to live with regret. After selling the Cross mansion to pay legal fees and victim restitution, she'd moved into a modest home near the edge of town, a dwelling that would have seemed impossibly small to the woman she'd been 6 months ago, but which suited the person she was trying to become. "It's peaceful," Margaret replied. "And I wanted to thank you again for the dress you made for the charity auction. It raised more money than we'd hoped for the school fund." Clara nodded, understanding the deeper conversation they were having. Margaret's charity work represented more than simple philanthropy. It was penance, an attempt to balance decades of complicity with meaningful action. Whether forgiveness would eventually follow remained to be seen, but the effort itself was genuine. "Boone's at the church, if you'd like to speak with him," Clara offered, noting the way Margaret's eyes always held a question she couldn't quite voice when his name came up. "Perhaps another time. It's complicated." Clara understood. The relationship between Margaret and Boone carried the weight of abandonment and guilt, of a stepmother who'd failed to protect a child and a son who'd survived without the family that should have sheltered him. Healing, if it came at all, would take time and careful navigation of emotional territory scarred by decades of neglect. As evening approached, Clara closed the shop and walked home through streets that had regained the comfortable rhythm of a community at peace with itself. The marshal's office had become a symbol of justice restored rather than power abused, with Sheriff Williams taking seriously his role as protector rather than enforcer for the wealthy. The bank had new ownership, local rather than territorial, with lending practices designed to build the community rather than extract wealth from it. She found Boone in their kitchen, reading to Ellie from Little Women while dinner simmered on the stove. The domestic scene would have seemed impossible during those desperate weeks when a stranger's marriage proposal represented her family's only hope for survival, but it had become the foundation of a contentment Clara had never expected to find again. "How's Beth doing?" Clara asked, settling into the chair beside them. "She's very sick," Ellie reported seriously. "But Joe is taking care of her, and families take care of each other no matter what." Clara caught Boone's eye over their daughter's head, sharing the silent communication that had developed between them over months of building a real marriage from the practical foundation of their original arrangement. Some of their conversations now took place entirely in glances and small gestures, the intimate shorthand of people who'd learned to trust each other's hearts as well as their intentions. After Ellie fell asleep, Clara and Boone sat on their front porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear prairie sky. The silver wedding rings they'd chosen together, simple bands that replaced the legal formality of their courthouse ceremony, caught the moonlight as Clara reached for his hand. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Coming here, getting tangled up with us?" Boone considered the question seriously, as he did most things, before answering. "I regret the deception at the beginning. I regret that my father's sins put you and Ellie in danger. But regret marrying you? Regret becoming Ellie's father? Never." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of a town at peace, dogs barking in the distance, the soft murmur of neighbors talking on their own porches, the gentle creak of windmill blades turning in the evening breeze. It was the sound of ordinary life, precious in its very commonality after months of uncertainty and violence. "Thomas would have liked you," Clara said eventually. "He always believed that good people found each other when they needed to most." "Maybe he was right," Boone replied, squeezing her hand gently. "Maybe the best things do come when we're brave enough to ask for help, even from strangers." Inside the house, a child slept peacefully in her own bed, secure in the knowledge that her family was complete and her future bright with possibility. Outside, a man and woman who'd found love in the most unexpected circumstances continued the quiet work of building a life worthy of the courage it had taken to defend it. Sometimes, Clara reflected, the most extraordinary stories were the ones that ended not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with the simple triumph of ordinary happiness earned through extraordinary faith in each other's essential goodness. And sometimes, just sometimes, asking for help from a giant cowboy could indeed change 3 lives forever, exactly as a 6-year-old girl had somehow known it would.